The tape measure made a sound like a rifle shot when she let it snap back. I stood in my mother's doorway, 4 cardboard boxes stacked at my feet, 3 days after we'd buried Margaret Sloan in the ground, and I watched my mother-in-law, Constance Vance, 64 years old, dressed in funeral black that she'd apparently decided to keep wearing, pull that yellow contractor's tape along the length of my mother's living room wall and consult a small leather notebook with the focus of a woman conducting a business transaction. 14 feet 2 inches, she murmured, writing something down. I didn't say anything for a long moment. My hand was still on the door frame. In my jacket pocket was a piece of paper I'd found folded in my mother's wallet at the hospital. I'd found it when I was gathering her things, when the nurses had brought out her belongings in a plastic bag marked personal effects, and I'd been searching for her insurance card, and instead found a small square of paper folded exactly 4 times, her handwriting on the outside. My darling, if you're reading this, everything is going according to plan. Start with Howard. I hadn't known what plan. I hadn't known any Howard. Standing there watching Constance measure my dead mother's living room wall, the paper suddenly felt like it weighed 5 pounds. Oh, Rita, sweetheart, I didn't hear you come in. I was just getting a sense of the space. She said it the way she said everything, warmly, smoothly, with a smile that stopped precisely at the upper lip and became something else. In 8 years of knowing her, I had cataloged that smile with the patience of a scientist studying a pattern she doesn't yet understand. I understood it now. I said very steadily, "Could you put the tape measure away?" It wasn't a question. She heard that. She folded the tape up with the calm of someone completing a task rather than being interrupted mid-scheme. And she smiled again, and neither of us said what we both understood. But I was thinking about the note. Everything going according to plan. What plan, Mom? What did you know that I didn't? I was about to find out. And it was going to rewrite 12 years of my life from the first line. My mother, Margaret Sloan, was a woman who kept things in small places. Notes in wallet pockets, receipts folded into the exact dimensions of their envelopes. A spare key to her apartment taped to the underside of a kitchen drawer. Not under the mat, not with a neighbor, but in a place so specific and deliberate that finding it by accident was nearly impossible. She had a landscape architect for a daughter, and she was fond of saying that a good landscape architect understands the value of putting the right thing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. I had always taken that as professional pride. I was not entirely wrong. I just didn't know she was talking about herself. I am 34 years old. I have been a landscape architect for 8 years, which means I have spent 8 years understanding topography, drainage, the behavior of soil, the specific patience required to plan a space that won't be finished for another 3 growing seasons. You put a thing in the ground and you account for what it will become. You think 10 years ahead. You consider the sight lines from the future, not just the present. My mother was the best landscape architect I have ever known, and she never drew a single plan. I built my firm, Green Line Design, out of 2 clients and a 12-year-old truck that smelled permanently of mulch. And I had, by the time this story takes place, 9 full-time projects and a waiting list that made me quietly proud. We lived in Millbrook, Ohio. I say we, meaning Seth Vance, my husband of 7 years, and me. Our house was on Sycamore Drive, and I'd laid the flagstone path myself, and the window boxes stayed full year-round because that was non-negotiable. And in the backyard, I had built something over 5 years that a client once called the most ambitious domestic garden she'd seen at that scale, which Seth had received as a compliment without seeming to understand what it cost in hours. Seth was 37. He worked for a regional financial management firm, and he had a quality I'd found reassuring when I was 26 and would spend the next 7 years learning to read more carefully. He was steady, consistent. He had the same lunch almost every weekday. He called his mother every Sunday at 11. He never forgot anniversaries or birthdays. He was, in every measurable surface metric, a good husband. The problem was structural, not cosmetic, and structural problems rarely show themselves until there's weight on them. Constance Vance was Seth's mother, and she was 64, and she had the kind of beauty that doesn't soften with age but sharpens. Fine bones, very good hair kept silver rather than colored, an eye for quality in clothing that communicated money without announcing it. She was on the board of the Millbrook Garden Club, the library's Friends Association, and the St. Catherine's Church Fundraising Committee. She owned 3 properties. She had an eye for real estate that I had, for several years, confused with an interest in real estate. It was not the same thing. The first time I brought Seth home, she'd stood in the doorway of my mother's apartment and looked at the living room with the specific quality of attention you give something you're assessing. Not admiring, assessing. I'd been 27 and in love, and I'd thought, she's just curious. My mother, who was in the kitchen making tea and had eyes in the back of her head, and apparently in every other direction too, had been thinking something different. My mother's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Delmar Street, a 2-bedroom with a good elevator and a view of the parking lot of a Thai restaurant she'd always liked. She said the smell of lemongrass in summer came through the window, and she considered it a feature. The apartment was full of her, books in double rows on the shelves, a reading chair worn to exactly the right depth, herbs in pots on the windowsill that required precise calibration of light and watering, a small blue ceramic bowl that sat by the kitchen window and held at various times a spare key, a rubber band, a birthday candle, a folded grocery receipt, and once a monarch butterfly that had made it through a screen and couldn't figure out how to leave. She had lived there for 18 years. It was, as Constance had noted on multiple occasions, prime area. I had not paid attention to those moments. I was paying attention now. The Silver Bell Stitch Circle met every other Thursday at rotating houses. There were 5 of us, and we had been meeting for 5 years, which meant we had moved through the normal stages of a group and arrived at something richer, a room where things could be said and heard and held. We did cross-stitch and embroidery, honest handwork, the kind that gives your hands something to do while your mind goes where it needs to go. We drank wine. Carol Sharp was my closest friend in the group, and possibly my closest friend in the world, which I had arrived at not by deciding, but by accumulation. 5 years of her showing up, saying true things, asking hard questions in direct language, and never once pretending the answer was better than it was. She was 35, a mortgage broker, and she lived 13 minutes from my house and drove a silver SUV that was slightly too large for her and that she referred to as the vessel. She used profanity the way some people use punctuation, functionally, without drama, because she'd decided life was too short for euphemisms. Diane Pruitt was 61 and retired from 30 years as a high school English teacher, which meant she had both a devastating sense of the ways narrative shapes expectation and the world's best buttercream recipe, which she deployed at emotionally significant moments. Jeanette Holt was 58 and had the intelligence network of a woman who has lived in one town for 30 years, raised 3 children there, and learned that the most useful thing you can know is who knows what. She gathered information the way some people breathe, continuously, without effort, as a matter of course. Linda Casey was 47, ran a catering business out of her home kitchen, and arrived at every gathering with approximately 4 times more food than 5 women could reasonably eat, which we all considered evidence of love. These were the women who would hold my next 3 months together. I didn't know that yet, sitting in my mother's doorway with the boxes and the tape measure and the note, but Margaret probably did. My mother was diagnosed 14 months before she died. Ovarian cancer, discovered at a routine appointment by a doctor who had the decency to be direct about it. She called me from the parking lot of the medical building, and her first words were, with dry, dark amusement, "Well, this is inconvenient." She had, by her own accounting, 18 months, which she described as generous given how thoroughly I intend to use them. She spent those months with characteristic precision. She organized her affairs. She said what she wanted to say to the people she wanted to say it to. She saw the hydrangeas in Lakeview Park bloom for what she knew would be the last time. And she spent 2 afternoons at Howard Neff's office on Ridgemont Avenue, completing the legal arrangements she had been building, piece by piece, for 12 years. She did not tell me about Howard. She did not tell me about the arrangements. She told me she loved me, and she told me the coffee maker was a fundamentally disappointing machine, and she told me that the herbs on the windowsill needed more morning light than I'd been giving them, by which she meant she'd noticed I'd moved them, and she'd moved them back. I drove to Delmar Street twice a week, sometimes more. We watched movies on her laptop, balanced on a TV tray. We ate soup from the diner on Clement Street because neither of us trusted our ability to cook during those months without burning something. We talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and sometimes we sat in the particular, comfortable silence of 2 people who have spent enough time together to have arrived at the far side of small talk, where silence is its own conversation. Seth came less than I would have liked. He was busy. That was sometimes true. He was uncomfortable with illness. That was always true. I told myself this was a manageable sadness. I built scaffolding around it and called the scaffolding understanding. I was good at building things. I should have looked more carefully at what I was building around. The month before she died, I came on a Tuesday afternoon, and she was in the kitchen when I arrived, moving more slowly than she had been, and she said something that I filed carefully and retrieved only weeks later. "I worry about you with that family, Rita. I want you to know you're going to be all right, whatever happens." "I know, Mom." "No, I want you to hear that. You are going to be completely all right." I thought she meant grief. I thought she was preparing me for her death. She was preparing me for something considerably more specific, and she was doing it with the precision of a woman who had been planning the same move for a very long time. She died on a Tuesday in late October. I was in the hallway outside her room, on the phone with a client about a drainage issue, when the nurse touched my shoulder. I ended the call mid-sentence. I went in, and she was still, and the window had a strip of late afternoon light falling across the foot of the bed, and I thought, the hydrangeas are gone for the year. She saw them in August. That's good. That's something. Hold on to that. Seth arrived 40 minutes after I called him. He'd been in a meeting he felt he couldn't leave. I noted that and filed it under later. The nurse brought a plastic bag, personal effects. Her phone, her reading glasses, her keys, her wallet. I opened it and searched for her insurance card, which was a reflex with no practical purpose. We were past insurance cards now. And instead, my fingers found a small square of paper, folded exactly 4 times, her handwriting on the outside. "My darling, if you're reading this, everything is going according to plan. Start with Howard." I looked at it. Across the room, Seth was speaking quietly to the nurse. The word Howard had no context for me. She'd mentioned no one by that name. I folded the note back along its creases and put it in my jacket pocket. Later. The room needed me first. The funeral was a Wednesday, a week later. It was a good funeral, the kind where people laugh as often as they cry, where the flowers are white and substantial, where the casseroles afterward arrive in quantities that suggest genuine community. Constance came, impeccably dressed, and she said all the right things to all the right people. She hugged me for a long, warm moment. She said, "We'll take care of you, Rita." She meant it. I know that now. She meant it in a very specific, very particular way that had nothing to do with comfort. The morning after the funeral, Thursday, Seth came downstairs looking like he'd had a phone conversation he'd rather not have had. "Mom was asking about the next steps," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "What next steps?" "With the apartment, the estate. She was thinking, she thought it makes sense to start getting organized." I looked at him. He looked at his coffee cup. "The funeral was yesterday, Seth." "I know. I told her it wasn't the right time." Friday was quieter. I went to work for 3 hours because I had a project deadline and because an empty house felt airless. When I got home, Seth was in the back office on the phone with the door closed. He didn't usually close the door. I told myself it was probably nothing. The note in my jacket pocket disagreed. Saturday morning, I loaded 4 cardboard boxes into my car and drove to Delmar Street. The building manager had given me keys at the hospital. I parked in the lot behind the Thai restaurant and stood there for a moment with my hand on the car roof, smelling the cold November air and the ghost of lemongrass from a kitchen that wasn't operating at this hour. Then I went upstairs and opened the door. Constance was at the far end of the living room with her tape measure and her small leather notebook, and she turned around with the composure of someone who had expected to be there alone for another hour. 14 feet, 2 inches, she had said. "Start with Howard." "All right, Mom, I'm starting." I found Howard Neff on Google. There was one estate attorney in the area with that name, a solo practice on Ridgemont Avenue called Neff and Associates, which was Howard and one legal assistant named Patricia, though the ampersand suggested a more substantial enterprise. I called Monday morning. "Rita Sloan Vance. I'm the daughter of Margaret Sloan. I was told to start with Howard." The pause on the other end had a particular quality, not confusion, but readiness. Then Patricia said, in the tone of someone who had been expecting exactly this call, "Mr. Neff has you on his calendar, Mrs. Vance. Your mother made the appointment. It's Tuesday at 2. My mother had made the appointment. Past tense. Pre-death. She had scheduled a meeting she would not be alive to attend, with the practical foresight of a woman who understood that certain things require a warm body in a chair, and she would not be providing hers. I said, "I'll be there." Howard Neff's office was on the second floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a tax preparer, accessed by a staircase with a worn wooden railing and a framed print of a New England coastline on the landing. Howard himself was 58, small and deliberate, with the careful kindness of a man who had spent 30 years holding other people's most important secrets and had developed a specific quality of gentleness around the weight of that. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "She spoke about you often, Mrs. Vance. She was very proud of you." He said it the way people say true and insufficient things, which is the only honest way to say them. He had a sealed envelope on his desk, my name in my mother's handwriting. Below it, "Open with Howard present." My hands were steady when I opened it. That surprised me. Inside was a letter, 6 pages, handwritten front and back on cream paper, dated September of that year, 2 months before she died. I read it. Howard waited with the particular stillness of someone who has practice in exactly this. At some point, he moved a box of tissues to the corner of his desk without comment, which was both a small kindness and a very accurate read of the room. My mother's letter. The apartment on Delmar Street had been transferred into my name in 2014, 10 years ago. She had done it through Howard with a proper deed transfer, properly witnessed and notarized, filed with the county recorder's office in Millbrook. She had not told me because telling me would have required explaining why, and explaining why would have required explaining Constance. She had been watching Constance Vance since the first time I brought Seth home. In the letter, she said, "I am not a woman given to paranoia. I need you to know that, because what I'm about to tell you will sound like paranoia, and it isn't. It is observation." I watched her look at my living room, and I saw the way she held the word prime area in her mouth before she said it, and I knew. Some people look at space and see what's in it. Constance looks at space and sees what could be in it instead. I've been watching her for 12 years. She had transferred the apartment because she couldn't be certain the cancer would give her time to fight. She had done it early enough, during full health at 62, that there could be no question of capacity. Howard's documentation confirmed every fact. There was more. She had left something at the Millbrook Public Library. She'd be specific about that later, she said, in Howard's records. And there was a safety deposit box at First Central Bank on Clement Street. The key was in the small blue ceramic bowl on the kitchen windowsill. "What's in the box will hurt," she wrote. "I am sorry for that. But you deserve to know who your father is." I put the letter down. Howard's office was very quiet. The HVAC hummed. Outside, November moved past the window without noise. "She recorded something," Howard said. "She asked me to play it for you, when you're ready." I wasn't. "Play it." 3 minutes and 20 seconds. My mother's voice, close and clear, as though she were sitting across the desk. "Hi, my darling. I know this is a lot. I know you're probably furious with me for keeping all of this while I was alive. I think you have every right to be." A breath. The sound of her settling herself the way she did when she was preparing to say something that mattered. "Your father is alive, Rita. His name is still Daniel Sloan, and he's been in Malaga, Spain for 17 years. He had to leave. This is a long story, and it's all in the letters in the box. But he had to leave, and the leaving broke him, and he's wanted to reach out to you for years. I have been the one saying no, year after year. I've been the one telling him you weren't ready. That was my call to make, and I made it, and I don't know if it was right." A pause. Her voice shifted, warmer, more immediate, the specific register she used when she was trying to reach across distance. "I love you with everything I have. I have spent 12 years making sure you would still be standing when the Constances of the world came for what was yours. Stand up straight. Use your professional expertise and your considerable backbone." The faintest sound of a smile. "And start with the library. The books are all true crime. I felt that was appropriate." 3 minutes and 20 seconds. I sat in Howard's office for a while after the recording ended. Howard made coffee that neither of us drank. Eventually, he walked me through the deed transfer, the probate timeline. Ohio law gave interested parties 90 days from the estate filing to contest. He told me Constance's attorney had already sent a letter suggesting Seth had a verbal understanding with his mother regarding the property. He said his response had been polite, specific, and decisive. The property was not part of the estate. It had been Margaret's to give, and she had given it, and there was nothing to contest. I drove home with the deed in a manila folder on the passenger seat and my mother's letter in my bag and a question list in my head that started with one very large item. How much does Seth know? Seth was making pasta when I came in Tuesday evening. He turned from the stove and registered something in my face. Not what it was exactly, but enough. How was the meeting? Sit down, Seth. He sat. I opened the folder on the kitchen table. I watched his face as he read the deed transfer. The specific stillness that came over him was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man who has been waiting for a particular train and is trying to decide how to be on the platform when it arrives. You knew, I said. I didn't know the specifics. Did your mother know the apartment was in my name? I don't know what Mom knew. Look at me, Seth. He looked at me. I kept my voice even. Did you know your mother was going to Delmar Street with a tape measure 3 days after my mother's funeral? He looked away. She asked me if the building had good bones. I thought she was just... He stopped. Just what? He didn't finish. The refrigerator hummed. In the silence between us, I heard everything he wasn't saying, which was considerable. And then the doorbell rang. We looked at each other. I went to the door. On the porch stood a young man, 25, khaki pants, camera bag, clipboard with a form on it, with the professional cheerfulness of someone who was about to perform a task without any idea it was wrong. Hi, Kyle from Ridgepoint Realty. I'm here for the photography appointment. Mrs. Constance Vance called this morning about a listing shoot, the property on Delmar Street. There's been a mistake. She said she had access. I looked at this young man with his light meter and his Ridgepoint Realty polo shirt and the expression of a person who had been sent into a minefield with a camera bag. I said, "Come in." Was it rational? No, but I needed Seth to see it, to see in this earnest young man with his clipboard exactly what his mother had done on the same day I'd been sitting in Howard's office. Kyle came in. He looked at the kitchen table, at the deed in the manila folder, at Seth, at me. He had a fine instinct for wrongness, and it was clearly firing on all cylinders. He said very quietly, "Should I wait?" I gestured to the living room. Kyle backed into it with professional dignity. I sat back across from Seth. Your mother called a real estate photographer this morning for my mother's apartment, which has been legally mine for 10 years. I let that sit. Your mother either knows about the transfer and is testing whether I know, or she doesn't, and she is catastrophically overstepping. Either way, where do you stand? From the living room came a small, polite sound, the click of a camera shutter. We both turned. Kyle was looking at the bookshelf, had reflexively taken a photograph of it, and was now holding the camera with the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. Not this apartment. Right, sorry, reflex. Seth looked at the deed. He looked at me. He looked at Kyle, who was attempting to become physically smaller. Then he said, with the heaviness of someone trying to be honest and not quite getting there in time, "She's my mother, Rita. I don't know how to..." That's the answer, isn't it? We didn't speak for the rest of the evening. Kyle let himself out sometime after 6. 3 days later, an automated email arrived from Ridgepoint Realty. "Here's your home's value estimate." I saved it. I told myself I'd frame it someday. I would. The next Thursday was Stitch Circle at Linda's, which meant a table covered in food from the moment you arrived. Linda had made 2 quiches, a fruit tart, and what she called emergency brownies, a batch she'd assembled at 11 the previous night because anxiety had required it. I ate 2 brownies standing up before I sat down and considered this medically justified. I told them everything, not in order, in the way you tell things to women who have known you for 5 years, which is non-linearly, with interruptions for outrage and occasional dark laughter and the particular silence of people rearranging what they know. Carol put down her embroidery hoop when I got to the tape measure. 3 days. 3 days. That woman brought a tape measure to... She stopped herself. She picked the hoop back up, and her grip on it was significant. And then the photographer. His name was Kyle. She hired Kyle. Kyle had no idea what he was walking into. "Poor Kyle," said Jeanette. Diane set down her thread and regarded me with the attention of someone who spent 30 years teaching people to recognize the shape of a story. "Your mother knew this was coming. That's what the letter says. She prepared for 12 years. Apparently." "What's in the library, Rita?" I'd been to see Howard again since the first visit. I'd gotten more detail about the probate timeline, more clarity about the transfer. I knew Constance's attorney had sent a letter about Seth's alleged verbal understanding. Howard's response had been 2 sentences. But the library, my mother's specific direction, I hadn't gone yet. I was building up to it. "Tomorrow," I said. "Carol's coming." "Obviously," said Carol. We spent the rest of the evening doing the thing we did, embroidering and talking in the loose, honest way of people who have given each other permission. Carol floated various approaches to the Constance situation, several of which were amusing, and none of which were intended as actual plans. Jeanette contributed specific intelligence about Constance's standing in the Millbrook Garden Club, the committee appointments, the social dependencies, the way her authority operated. Diane read a passage from something she'd been rereading, without explanation, that was about the long patience of women who wait and plan. Linda kept everyone's wine levels consistent and asked at one point, "Should we be talking about the Christmas party?" "Burn it down," said Carol. "I meant the planning, the venue." "I know what you meant." I drove home that night steadier than I'd arrived. Not better, steadier. The difference matters. The Millbrook Public Library was on Jefferson Street, brick and glass, with a small garden at the entrance that I had designed pro bono 4 years earlier. Ornamental grasses and black-eyed Susans and a row of dwarf lilac along the western edge. They'd sent a thank you card with everyone's signatures, including the head librarian's, E. Marsh, professional classification. Edna Marsh was 63, 5 feet tall, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain of amber beads. She had worked at this library for 31 years, and she regarded the Dewey Decimal System as a personal responsibility, which I found, under the circumstances, deeply comforting. When Carol and I came in Friday morning, Edna was at the reference desk, and she looked up with the expression of a woman who had been expecting us. "Mrs. Vance, I've been hoping you'd come by." "About my mother's donation." "Yes, 47 volumes." She paused. She took off her glasses. "I've been doing this work for 31 years, Mrs. Vance. I have processed a great many donations. Your mother's was, I would say, the most thoroughly annotated collection I have ever encountered." Another pause. "I think you should look at them before I shelve them." Carol, behind me, made a quiet sound that could have been anything. Edna led us to the periodicals room, warm, slightly dim, where 47 true crime volumes were arranged on 2 long tables. Margaret Sloane had kept a reading journal for years. I knew that. I had not known the journal was distributed across 4 decades of criminal case studies organized by conflict type. My mother had color-coded her annotations. Blue ink, dates and amounts. Red ink, names. Green ink, what she called, in a note card key tucked into the first volume, pattern recognition. She had been documenting Constance Vance since 2012. Not directly, never directly. That was not her way, and that was not a method that would survive scrutiny. She had embedded her intelligence in literary criticism. A note about a book subject, the long game approach to asset acquisition, was not about the book. A note about C visiting, spent 11 minutes discussing proximity to downtown, asked twice about building age, fourth visit in 14 months, pattern establishing, was buried in the margin of a chapter about a real estate fraud scheme from 1987. You had to know what you were looking for. Once you knew, you couldn't stop seeing it. Carol and I sat in the periodicals room for 2.5 hours. The 2012 volumes established the pattern. Constance's repeated visits, her interest in the apartment, her language about the property. The 2014 volumes noted, very briefly, in blue ink, transfer complete, Howard confirmed, she doesn't know, R doesn't know, the wall is built. I looked at that for a long time. Then I found 2016. The annotations in that volume were denser, in red ink, compressed, the way handwriting gets when there's too much to say and not enough margin. S signed a letter of intent regarding the Delmar property. He may not fully understand what he signed. C told him it was a family estate planning formality. It was not. Howard says it carries no legal standing given the 2014 transfer. But S knows, or should know, that his mother has been actively working to claim the property for 4 years. He signed. I read it twice. I looked up. Carol was at the other end of the table, jaw tight, reading something from 2018. Seth signed something, I said. Yeah, said Carol, not looking up. Your mom found out. I looked at the 2016 entry again. S knows, or should know. My mother, who chose words with the precision of someone who understands that written things outlast their moment, had left both possibilities on the page. She had not decided which one was true. She had left that to me. I sat with that in the quiet of the periodicals room, with Edna somewhere in the building going about the work of classification, and 47 volumes of true crime arranged around me like the most meticulously organized fortress I had ever seen. She never told me. She was protecting you. From my own husband. A silence. From knowing how bad it was, Carol said. Maybe she thought she had time to fix it. Maybe she thought she could keep the wall up long enough that you'd never need to know what was behind it. I looked at a 2019 entry in red. C asked again, more direct this time. Told her Margaret's wishes are her own. She smiled. She always smiles. And then, below it, in different ink, written later, a separate visit to the page. If I am not here to hold this wall, it holds itself. That's why I built it that way. My mother had stood in this library, in this neighborhood, checking out her own dossier, adding to it over 12 years, and she had built a legal structure that would stand without her. That was what she had built. Not just the deed transfer, the entire architecture of Rita Sloane's future, designed to hold under load, drainage accounted for, sightlines clear. I knew what this was. I had spent 8 years learning to see it. This was her best work. That evening, I sat in my car in the Sycamore Drive driveway for 4 minutes before I went inside. This was not procrastination. It was the particular preparation required before you say something that cannot be unsaid. Seth closed his laptop when he heard the door. The gesture had become reflexive in a way I had only recently begun to count. I put my bag on the counter. I kept my jacket on. Tell me about the letter of intent. The quality of his silence told me what his words were going to do before he found them. Mom mentioned it was Seth, the letter you signed in 2016 about my mother's apartment. Tell me exactly what you understood you were signing. He looked at his hands. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd stopped noticing the weight until someone named it. She said it was for family estate planning, that it would help the property pass smoothly to our family. Our family.
Did you tell me?
It didn't seem like. I didn't think. Did you know your mother wanted my mother's apartment? He was quiet for long enough that the quiet became its own answer. Then, with the specific exhaustion of a man telling a truth he's been avoiding for years, I knew she was interested in it. I thought it was just talk. I didn't think she'd actually do anything. You didn't think, or you thought you didn't have to. He looked up. His eyes were tired. Rita, not with anger, with something colder and more complete. The problem isn't that you didn't fight for me, Seth. The problem is that it never occurred to you to try. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't, because it was true, and he knew it, and some part of him had probably known it for years without finding a way to say so. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. The house was very quiet in the way houses get when something load-bearing has been identified. I took my bag to the guest room. Not a dramatic gesture, a practical one. There was too much in my head to share space with someone else's silence. In the morning, I drove to Delmar Street with a mug of coffee and sat in my mother's kitchen and looked at the small blue ceramic bowl on the windowsill. The key was gone. The bowl was empty. The plant beside it was very much alive, which I took as the specific kind of encouragement available in that moment. Working on it, Mom. The safety deposit box was at First Central Bank on Clement Street, 4 blocks from the diner where my mother and I had eaten soup. I found the key in the ceramic bowl exactly where she'd said, a small brass key, unassuming, the kind that could be anything. Sylvia, the bank manager, was practical and kind in the way of people who do this regularly. And she opened the box and left me alone in the vault room with fluorescent light and a metal box containing 23 years of correspondence between my parents. Letters, handwritten, spanning 1999 to August of this year. Return addresses from Seville, then Cadiz, then Malaga. All in the same handwriting. Slightly angular, architectural, familiar in a way that shouldn't have been familiar but was, because some things run in blood even when the source is absent. The first letters were from 1999, 1 year after he'd left. My father had been 38. He'd written, "Margaret, I have no right to ask anything, but please tell me she is safe. Please tell me she is well." My mother had written back. I found a folder at the bottom of the box containing her drafts, and she had said, "She is safe and well, and she is going to be extraordinary, and she does not need this complication right now." He had left because he'd been an architect working on a development project that involved people who had not been doing legal things. He had found out too much. The people who were doing the illegal things had given him a choice: leave quietly or face consequences that would reach his family. He had chosen what he thought was the safer option for us. In the letters, he wrote this plainly, with the self-awareness of a man who has had 17 years to understand that he made the least bad choice available and that it was still a terrible choice. He did not excuse himself, he explained himself. The distinction matters. For 17 years, he had been writing to my mother. For 17 years, she had been writing back, measured, careful, updating him on the facts of my life, without, apparently, ever suggesting he reach out directly. The letters documented a negotiation. Him asking, over and over, with the patient desperation of a man who has accepted the terms of his own exile but cannot quite stop wanting to be known. Her saying, in different ways each time, not yet, not now, she's not ready. The last letter was from August, 2 months before she died. Margaret, I know it's serious this time. I have kept my promise to respect your judgment about Rita, but I need to ask you one more time. Let me write to her. I am not asking to be her father. I understand I forfeited that. I am asking to be known to her. I am 65 years old, and I am in Malaga, and she doesn't know I'm alive. At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, a photograph folded in half. My mother and my father, on a harbor somewhere, I would recognize later as the harbor at Malaga, both older than any photograph I had of them together, which was to say considerably older than my memory of him at 38. He was gray. She was in her good blue jacket. They were standing closer together than strangers stand, and his hand was not quite touching her shoulder. On the back, in her handwriting, March 2023, he's well. He's been waiting. And below the photograph, a note card, a Spanish phone number with an international code. Sylvia came in once with a cup of water and set it on the table without a word and left. I was not aware of how long I was there. Long enough. The thing I kept returning to, underneath the grief, underneath the fury, underneath the complicated awe of discovering that my mother had been running a covert operation on 2 fronts simultaneously for 12 years, was this. Both of my parents had loved me in ways that cost them something. My mother had loved me by building walls and keeping secrets and dying with her work in order. My father had loved me by staying away when staying away was what my mother asked of him, for reasons I was only now beginning to understand. They had both made choices I didn't get to weigh in on. They had both decided in their particular ways that protecting me required keeping things from me. I understood the logic. I was furious with both of them. Both things were entirely true, and I would need a long time to hold them at once. I walked out of the bank into the November air. I called Carol. "Get wine," I said. "How much?" "A significant amount, Carol." "On my way." Carol sat at my kitchen table, the Sycamore Drive kitchen, which had ceased being mine in any meaningful sense, and she listened to the full account of the safety deposit box without interruption, which for Carol required considerable discipline. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her wine glass and looked at it. "Your mother was corresponding with your father for 23 years. 23 years. While managing the Constance situation. While managing the Constance situation. While you had no idea. While I had absolutely no idea." Carol drank, set the glass down. "She was protecting you from how complicated everything was. She was protecting me from having to choose, from having to decide whether to stay in a marriage where my husband's mother was circling my mother's apartment and my husband was signing documents on his mother's behalf. She built a fortress around all of it and let me live inside it like I was safe. I looked at my own wine glass. I was safe. That's the thing. She made me completely safe. I just didn't know from what. And the father. and the father. We sat with that for a while. Outside, a November wind moved through the sycamores. Carol poured more wine without asking, which was the appropriate response. Are you going to call him? I don't know yet. You're going to call him. I don't know. Rita, you're going to call him. Not pushy, certain. The way Carol said things, she'd already understood. I thought about the photograph, the harbor, his hand not quite touching her shoulder. He's well. He's been waiting. Let me deal with one thing at a time. The weekend Seth and I had our real conversation, the one that had been building for 8 years. We sat across from each other in the living room with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us, and I told him about the safety deposit box. I told him about the 23 letters and the photograph in the harbor. I told him my father was alive in Malaga. His shock was genuine. The father was not something he'd known. That mattered, and I noted it. I also told him about the library books, about the annotations, about the 2016 entry that read S knows or should know. He was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice had the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a version of events that no longer holds weight. I knew she wanted it. I knew she'd been interested for a long time. I thought it would stop on its own, or I thought it wasn't serious. I kept moving the concern to next week. For 4 years. For 4 years. Seth, your mother has been trying to take my mother's property for 12 years. Your mother went to my mother's apartment 3 days after the funeral with a tape measure. She hired a real estate photographer the same day I was at the estate attorney's office. And in 2016, you signed a document she prepared, and you told me nothing. Rita, I'm not asking you to be a villain. I'm asking you to tell me who you are. Because I've been married to you for 7 years, and I don't think I've ever actually made you answer that question. The silence that followed was enormous. Not empty, full. Full of everything we'd been navigating around. The way you navigate around a subsidence in a garden without naming what caused it. He said finally, with quiet, tired honesty, I don't know how to choose against my mother. I've never known how. I thought I could manage it, manage both of you, without having to choose. And I know how that sounds. I know how it sounds too. I'm sorry. I believe you. And I did. I also knew that I'm sorry and I know how to be different were 2 separate sentences, and he'd only said one of them, and he probably couldn't say the other. I went to Delmar Street that night. I made coffee in my mother's kitchen. I sat with the letters and the photograph and the plant on the windowsill, and I looked at the empty ceramic bowl. Everything going according to plan. What was the plan, Mom? Was this part of it? Sitting in your kitchen at 11 o'clock, understanding that my marriage was ending, understanding that my father was alive, understanding that you spent 12 years building a fortress to protect me from needing to know either of those things? Was this the point where the plan was complete? I thought about the measuring tape in her desk drawer, the small fabric dressmaker's tape she'd kept for years, soft, 12 feet long, for knowing exactly where everything stood. I thought about what she'd said to me once about landscaping. You put a thing in the ground and you account for what it will become. She had put the deed in the ground in 2014, and she had accounted for what it would become. And what it had become was this. A Tuesday night in November, her daughter sitting in her kitchen, finally ready to know everything. Because the time for protection was over. and the time for standing had arrived. I sat there until 2 in the morning. I made 3 cups of coffee. I read the letters again, more slowly. My father had a dog named Martes, Tuesday in Spanish, found on a Tuesday. He had a practice on the Calle Alcazabilla. He had been writing to my mother for 23 years, and in every single letter, there was a moment where he asked about me. And in every reply, my mother had told him something specific, a project, an achievement, a characteristic detail. He had received, from a distance, the running account of a life he hadn't been permitted to be part of. I read his description of what I'd been like at 9, the year he left. He'd written it in 2019, looking back. She was very serious about things. She had a particular way of examining something she didn't understand. She'd look at it sideways, like it was a puzzle she didn't want to alarm into moving. I think about that a lot. I hope she still does that. I do. 2 weeks later, the stitch circle was at Jeanette's, and I brought the harbor photograph. And Linda brought 3 kinds of bruschetta and a tart she described as emotionally restorative, which was both accurate and exactly what the situation required. I told them about the letters, about my father, about Malaga. I watched their faces move through the specific sequence of emotions the story demanded: shock, then grief, then the complicated admiration you feel for a person who loved someone so strategically and so completely that they planned for every contingency from a distance. Diane, who had been working on a fox in a waistcoat for 3 months and was now nearly finished with it, looked at me over her embroidery and said, slowly, with the weight of someone who has thought carefully before speaking, "Your mother didn't keep secrets to control you. She kept secrets to give you time. That's a different thing." I know. Are you furious with her anyway? Yes. Good. You should be. A pause. And then at some point, you'll just be grateful. Probably both at once, for a while. Jeanette was threading her needle with the precise focus of someone who had also been thinking. "What's the situation with Constance's attorney?" I told her. Howard had responded to the letter definitively. The probate timeline was proceeding without the Delmar Street apartment in it. Constance's legal position was, as Howard had put it, not strong. "And her garden club position?" said Jeanette. We looked at each other. "I haven't said anything," I said. "Nor have I," said Jeanette. She paused with a serenity that was very slightly theatrical. "Though I did mention to Barbara Howell, just in conversation, that the Delmar Street property situation had been resolved in a very straightforward manner." "Barbara Howell, who is on the Garden Club board?" said Carol. "I believe she is," said Jeanette. "Interesting," said Diane. "Should we plan the January gathering?" said Linda. "I was thinking we could do it at my place again. I've been experimenting with a new soup." "God, yes," said Carol. We embroidered. We drank wine. Carol's bird of prey, nearly complete, regarded us all with appropriate dignity from the embroidery hoop. I was working on something new, a landscape, horizontal bands of color, open and unconstructed. I was making it up as I went, which, for a landscape architect, is either terrifying or exactly right. It was exactly right. The Garden Club's annual winter meeting was held at the Millbrook Community Center in December. Linda's catering company provided refreshments, which was a fact I held with specific appreciation of the geometry. 45 members attended, spouses sometimes in tow, the kind of gathering that functions as both a planning session and a social checkpoint. a place where the community takes stock of itself. I was not a garden club member. Carol was. Jeanette was. Diane attended as a retired former member. Seth's sister Brenda was there. Kyle, the photographer I had recently learned from Jeanette, was the nephew of Brenda Mercer, which was Seth's sister Brenda, formerly Brenda Vance. Kyle had mentioned, in the way young people mention things to family, that he'd had a very strange real estate shoot that had turned out to be a whole thing. Brenda had, apparently, been turning this over in her mind for several weeks. The meeting moved through its agenda: spring plant sale, the Jefferson Park installation. I had designed the lilac border there, which was a detail I sat with quietly. The holiday donation drive. Then, open discussion. Constance raised her hand. "I want to address something briefly," she said. "There's been some confusion about the Delmar Street property, my late sister-in-law Margaret Sloane's apartment. I want to assure everyone that my family is managing the estate responsibly and that any questions about the property can be directed through our attorney." 3 rows back, Carol was looking at her phone. From near the back of the room, a small, precise woman raised her hand. Patricia Neff, Howard's legal assistant, a garden club member of 8 years standing, the person who had picked up the phone when I'd called on Monday morning and said your mother made the appointment. "I think that matter has been resolved," Patricia said, in the mild tone of a woman correcting a filing error rather than a social power play. "The Delmar Street property isn't part of the estate. It was transferred to Margaret Sloane's daughter in 2014. The county records are public record." She set her hand back in her lap. The room did a specific thing, a shifting. Not dramatic, not loud. The kind of shift that happens in a well-maintained social structure when a load-bearing assumption turns out to be false. 45 people quietly revised what they thought they knew. Constance's expression held for 3 full seconds. Then it moved. Barely, almost nothing, but enough for someone watching her as carefully as I had been trained by 12 years of proximity and my mother's 12 years of documentation to see. She had known. She had known the transfer existed. The attorney's letter had been a probe, a test of whether the transfer could be shaken or obscured. It could not. Patricia had just said so in front of everyone. "Of course. Thank you for the clarification." From the far side of the room, with something that sounded like a decision being made. "Very clear," said Brenda Mercer. "Seth's sister, 41 years old." She said it looking at her mother with an expression I had never seen on Brenda's face. Assessing, careful, something accumulating toward the surface. The meeting moved on. Millbrook moved on, the way Millbrook does, by quietly shifting who it invites to what and who gets called first about the committee chair, and who receives the tone of an organization that has made up its mind. Constance would not lose her positions overnight. Millbrook was too civilized for that. But the temperature in certain rooms would drop, and she would feel it. And she knew how to read rooms as well as anyone. Carol called me that evening with a full account. "Patricia Neff is my new favorite person. Howard raised her right. Howard is her employer, not her father. I know, still." I sat in the Delmar Street kitchen after we hung up, with wine and the plant and the empty bowl, and I tried to feel triumphant. What I felt instead was tired and sad, and underneath the tired, something beginning to feel like space. The particular open-air quality of a thing that no longer has a wall around it. I met Constance for coffee on a Saturday in early December. She suggested it, called very warmly, and said she thought it might be good to talk. Her voice had the quality of someone who has reassessed the board and is trying to identify the remaining move. We met at a diner on Clement Street. She was there when I arrived, gray today instead of black, hands folded on the formica, tea already ordered. Rita, I want you to know that none of this has been personal. Real estate situations with estates can become complicated very quickly, and I never intended, Constance, the apartment isn't in the estate. I know that. I've spoken to my attorney. Then what are we here to discuss? A pause. She picked up her tea, set it down. The family, you and Seth. Whatever happens between you, I hope... Constance. I waited until she was fully attended. I'm going to say this once. The apartment is mine and has been mine for 10 years. Your attorney's letter has been answered. There is nothing to revisit there. I leaned forward slightly. What I want you to understand is this. My mother watched you for 12 years. She documented what she saw. She did it quietly, without ever asking you to stop, without ever confronting you. She simply built something you couldn't move. A pause. The diner was warm and ordinary around us. I have what she built. I'm not going to use it publicly, but it exists, and it will exist, and I think you already know most of what's in it. Her teacup was very still. I also want to be clear that what is happening between Seth and me is between Seth and me. It has to do with who he chose to be in our marriage, and that is not your fault and not your responsibility to fix. I stood, picked up my bag. The garden installation at St. Catherine's, the one coming up in spring. You'll want someone with a different aesthetic. I can recommend a colleague. I walked to the door. Behind me, very quietly, she said something. I was at the door and I didn't stop and I didn't catch the words. Whatever she said, it was the first thing she'd said in that conversation without a calculation behind it. That was enough. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and let my heart beat hard because it had been a hard thing and hard things should be felt. Then I started the engine and drove to the library because Edna had set aside the last 5 volumes from my mother's donation, 2020 through 2023, and Saturday morning was a good time for reading, and the light in the periodicals room was warm. The divorce was filed in January. Seth and I agreed to it without bitterness, which is its own kind of grief, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make much noise because there's nothing left to break. He had chosen not to fight for the marriage, which was the answer to a question I hadn't quite asked directly, but had been asking for 7 years in smaller ways. He took what was his and some of what had become jointly ours, and I kept what mattered, which was the landscape of my own life, the firm, the apartment, the clear sense of where things stood. Howard filed the final estate documents in February. Margaret Sloane's estate was modest: savings, personal property, the ceramic bowl, the plant, and perfectly in order, which anyone who had known her should have expected. There was a final document, her instructions regarding her personal library. All books, including 47 volumes of true crime, to the Millbrook Public Library. I stopped by to see the final arrangement. Edna had shelved the true crime collection in the true crime section, all 47 volumes, annotations intact, available for general checkout. Mrs. Sloane was very specific that they remain accessible, Edna said. She would be. The annotations have attracted some interest. A small pause. The 2016 volume has been checked out twice. By whom? Library records are confidential, Mrs. Vance. A pause, measured as everything Edna did. The borrower's address is on Greenfield Way. Greenfield Way. where Constance lived. I stood in the true crime section of the Millbrook Public Library, and I thought about my mother, who had spent 12 years annotating a dossier about the woman she was afraid of, and had donated it, every volume, every margin note, to the public record of a building in the neighborhood where that woman lived. You absolute genius. Edna turned away with the expression of a woman who professionally neither heard nor did not hear that. Seth's sister Brenda called in February. We had never been close. There was always a Constance-shaped distance between us, but she called. Something that sounded like years of things arriving at once. I just want you to know I think Mom was wrong about the apartment. About all of it. I've thought that for a long time. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. I told her I appreciated it. She asked if we could have coffee sometime. I said yes. I meant it. I called Spain in March. The first time, I let it ring too long and hung up. The second time, I let it ring until someone answered. Yes? Hello? Hi, this is Rita Sloan. A silence. Then, very quietly, in a voice that was nothing like what I'd imagined, and exactly what it needed to be, Rita. He said it the way you say a name you've been practicing saying for a long time. I am so sorry it took this long. We talked for 42 minutes. I checked the clock after we hung up. 42 minutes is not very long in terms of 25 years, but it was the right length for a beginning. He had a dog named Martis. He had a practice on the Calle Alcazabilla, small residential work. He had gray hair and the same angle of jaw as the photograph, and a way of pausing before he said important things that was, I realized, not something I had inherited from my mother. He told me things about the leaving, carefully, aware of how long I'd been without this information, and I listened, and I asked some questions, and I cried once, briefly, and he waited without speaking until I was ready, which was the correct thing to do, and suggested he had some understanding of what the 42 minutes required of both of us. At the end of the call, he said, quietly, with careful hope, Your mother told me about the landscape work, the Lakeview Park installation. She said you had her eye, her sense of where things should go. I looked at the plant on the windowsill, at the empty ceramic bowl, at the new curtains, darker blue than my mother's, more my choice than hers. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a while. I have 25 years of things to say. I hope we have time. I flew to Spain in May. 9 hours, the first 3 spent not knowing what to do with my hands, the next 3 working on a client project, the last 3 looking out at the Atlantic and thinking about my mother, who had managed a 25-year transatlantic correspondence, a 12-year domestic intelligence operation, a real estate legal strategy, and her daughter's emotional schedule, all simultaneously, while having cancer and being, by all outward appearances, simply a woman who kept a reading journal and liked lemongrass. I thought, she must have been so tired. I thought, she must have been magnificent. Malaga in May was warm and close and fragrant, salt and exhaust and something floral from upper building window boxes. And I took a taxi from the airport and called my father from the hotel lobby, and he arrived in 12 minutes, which suggested he'd been nearby. He was 65, gray, heavier in the shoulders, lined in the face in the way of men who have spent time in sun and in difficulty. He had the particular quality of someone who has made peace with something long and hard, and now carries it quietly rather than setting it down. He held out his hand, and I put my arms around him instead, and I cried in the lobby of the hotel in a way that 25 years of unanswered questions require, and he held still and didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't entirely okay, and he seemed to understand that. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. I know." We walked to the harbor. The late afternoon light was the same as in the photograph, the particular Mediterranean slant that makes things look finished and warm and exactly as they should be. He showed me where the photograph had been taken. We stood there without speaking for a while. He had kept all of her letters, organized them chronologically in a wooden box he'd built himself, joints tight and corners square, the way architects build things. He said, "With the weight of an old grief that has become settled without becoming small. She wrote about you all the time. She was proud of everything you did, the firm, the park installation, a window box project she found particularly elegant." He looked at me with quiet warmth. "She said you had her eye, her sense of where things should go." I looked at the harbor, the blue of it, the way the late light moved on the surface. My mother had stood here 14 months before she died, in her good blue jacket, and someone had taken a photograph, and she had put it in a box for me. She had known, standing here in this exact light, that she would not see it again. And she had wanted me to have evidence of it. She had wanted me to know she'd been here, in this harbor, in this light, with this man she'd been writing to for 23 years, because she wanted me to know who she was, fully, finally, without the careful management of information that had, for years, been the primary expression of her love. The measuring tape was in my bag, the small dressmaker's tape from her desk, 12 feet, soft fabric, both inches and centimeters. I had brought it without entirely knowing why. Standing in the harbor, I knew why. Some things come with you because they are the right things to carry. Back in Millbrook, the apartment on Delmar Street had new curtains and a better coffee maker and a plant on the windowsill that was, by May, growing noticeably faster than it had any reason to. The flagstone path on Sycamore Drive was someone else's concern now. I had a different address, and it was mine. The Silver Bell Stitch Circle met the Thursday after I returned from Spain. I brought photographs, and Linda brought 3 things she called welcome home food, which was generous and accurate. Carol looked at the harbor photograph and said, "You're going back. This summer." Good. Diane held the photograph of the harbor and looked at it for a long time. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone who has spent 30 years teaching people to understand the endings of stories, "Your mother set all of this up, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. We both knew it wasn't. "All of it," I said. "She set all of it up." We sat with that for a moment, all 5 of us, in the warm light of Linda's dining room, needles and thread in our hands, the specific satisfaction of a room where things have been said and properly heard. "I'm starting a new piece," I said. "A harbor, blue and white, lots of sky." "For the apartment?" said Jeanette. "For the wall above the desk." The Ridgepoint Realty automated email was framed in a small black frame on the kitchen shelf between a photograph of my mother and the empty ceramic bowl. When people asked about it, I said it was performance art. This was approximately true. The measuring tape was in the desk drawer next to her letter. I took it out sometimes, not to measure anything in particular, just to feel the specific weight of a plan carried from its beginning to its end, with care, with patience, with the precise understanding of where every piece needed to go. She had known where everything should go. She had made sure it got there. I poured coffee in my mother's kitchen, my kitchen, in my apartment, with my curtains and my plant and the lemongrass that had started in the air again as May came in through the window. I stood at the window and I thought about a woman who had spent 12 years thinking ahead, who had looked at her daughter's life and seen the fault lines before her daughter could, who had decided that the most loving thing she could do was quietly, methodically, without drama or credit, build a structure that would hold. Everything going according to plan. She had always known. She had written it on a square of paper and folded it 4 times and put it in her wallet where I would find it. And she had trusted me to read it and do what came next. I did. It took a while, but I did. To the window, to the plant, to the empty bowl, to the harbor photograph I'd taped to the wall where I could see it from the kitchen table. Good plan, Mom. The lemongrass came in through the window, and the coffee was decent, and the morning was mine.